In this sense, God is all-pervading and all-powerful, because, according to Polkinghorne, if God did not sustain the action of the laws of nature at a given place, at a given time, then things would simply stop happening there. Matter would cease to exist. In general, if God ceased to sustain the laws of nature, the whole universe would cease to exist. So according to Polkinghorne, God is completely necessary, is all-powerful, all-pervading, sustaining everything, but God's role is simply limited to sustaining the laws of nature. Everything happens according to those laws. So if you want to know what is going on in the world, all you need to do is solve the equations of physics, and that will tell you. Actually, Polkinghorne gave this as an example of the great faithfulness of God and the great consistency, that God never deviates, even in the slightest degree, from what the calculations, according to the laws of physics, would prescribe for natural phenomena. So this is his idea. However, once again, this eliminates the possibility of religion. If our own nature is that we are simply material phenomena developing and transforming according to these natural laws, then there's no question of having any kind of relationship with God. Now, another aspect here also is that this mechanistic view eliminates the possibility of a non-physical mind that interacts with the material body. The problem there is completely analogous to the problem of interaction between God and the physical universe. If you have a non-physical mind which causes the body to move in a certain way according to the will of that mind, then that means a violation of the laws of physics. There are no terms in the equations of physics to allow any kind of mind to interfere with what's going on in the brain. So if you say that that does happen, you're saying that the laws of physics are being violated in the brain. So on this basis, scientists have traditionally, for the last 2 centuries or so, rejected the idea that there's a non-physical mind. You can find many books today that will say that since this would violate the laws of physics, it must be ruled out. So that's another consequence. The mind then, according to this theoretical view, must be simply a manifestation of the brain. The total human being is simply a material phenomenon which is occurring according to certain physical laws, and that's it. So this is the legacy of the mechanistic viewpoint in physics. And these ideas were quite thoroughly developed by the latter part of the 19th century. So now in the 20th century in physics there was a substantial revolution in thought, namely the development of the quantum mechanics, the quantum theory. And many people have thought that the quantum theory may possibly introduce or reintroduce an element of free will into physical science. The reason for this is that quantum mechanics is not a deterministic theory. In classical physics, as I was saying, what happens at one moment is strictly determined by what happened a moment before, and so forth. But in quantum mechanics, there's the idea of random events. Things can happen in a completely unpredictable way, so that what happens at one moment could not be predicted based on what was happening a moment before. So some have proposed that, well, perhaps quantum mechanics then would allow for free will to be reintroduced into our picture of the universe. However, the actual effect of quantum mechanics has been to push the idea of a transcendental intelligence even further into the background. If you look at the literature produced by physicists in the 19th century, you'll find that many physicists were Christians, and they also speculated along theological lines, in a way similar perhaps to that of this John Polkinghorne. That is, they proposed that God was somehow involved in the universe. But with the development of quantum mechanics, this idea was even more thoroughly eliminated. And the reason for this is that quantum mechanics makes it impossible to clearly visualize what matter is, so that it becomes impossible to clearly picture even what the world is, what to speak of anything transcendental to the world of matter. Basically, quantum mechanics gives a non-representational picture of material phenomena. The mathematics does not allow one to form any image of what is actually there. At most, it simply allows one to make statements about correlations between experimental observations. So, as a result of this development, most physicists in the 20th century have adopted a philosophy called positivism in order to understand their theories of physics. Basically, what positivism says is that you cannot say what is really there in nature. All you can do is observe correlations between experimental results. So according to this idea, a physical theory is merely some set of mathematical calculations which enable us to predict what an experiment is going to produce. And if in fact the calculations accurately predict the results of the experiment, then it's a good theory. And if they don't make an accurate prediction, then it's a bad theory. But in either case, we can't make any statement about what's actually there. That's not even a scientific question. If you ask what is actually there, you're delving into areas of metaphysics that have nothing to do with science. So that's the modern viewpoint, basically. So according to this idea, if you ask what is the relation between God and matter, you run into the problem of saying, well, what is matter? And finding that the scientists, disapprove of even raising that question. So that's the current situation in physical science. So that's a bit of historical background. So what I'll do now is briefly describe a little bit about what the Vedic literatures say about the relation between God and matter. And then we'll try and see if there's some possibility of bridging the gap between the modern scientific viewpoint and the viewpoint you find in the Vedic literature. So in the Vedic literature, the matter is basically described under the heading of what is called Sankhya philosophy. And there are chapters on Sankhya philosophy in various parts of the Vedic literatures. In the Srimad Bhagavatam, for example, this is discussed extensively in the teachings of Lord Kapila to Devahuti. That's just one example. So, at first glance, one may have the impression that the Sankhya philosophy is very naive from a modern scientific point of view, because it describes matter as being made of earth, air, fire, water, and ether. And one might initially think that this is a very archaic and outmoded idea. In fact, before what is known as the scientific revolution in Europe, people in Europe were thinking that matter is made of earth, air, fire, and water. And they also postulated an element called ether. Actually, you know the word quintessence. Quintessence means the fifth substance. Quint and essence. So that's originally the meaning of that is ether. It's the fifth element. The first four are earth, air, fire, and water. So these ideas in Europe were inherited from the ancient Greeks. For example, Aristotle spoke of these elements. And you'll find an interesting correlation between some of the things Aristotle had to say about earth, air, fire, water, ether, and so forth, and the Vedic literature. For example, Aristotle proposed that there is a shell of earth, then a shell of water outside of that, then a shell of air, a shell of fire, then finally a shell of ether. This is surrounding the earth. So in the Vedic literature, you'll find a similar conception, but there the successive shells surround the universe as a whole. According to Aristotle's picture, these shells were much smaller. So you reached the shell of ether by the time you got to the orbit of the moon, which meant the moon must be made of ether. So according to the medieval view, all the planets starting with the moon were ethereal. And you find the grosser elements only beneath the level of the moon's orbit. Nonetheless, you can see a correlation there between the Vedic picture and the picture that Aristotle had, and there may well be some historical connections. So the idea of earth, air, fire, water, and ether that you find in Aristotelian thought, the idea there is that these are separate substances which mix together to form all the different forms of matter that we experience. However, in the Sankhya philosophy, there's a different conception. And this is that these elements are successive modifications of one underlying element. Actually, in the Sankhya philosophy, you begin with a fundamental material substrate which is called pradhana. So this pradhana can be thought of as an exceedingly subtle form of matter, which we wouldn't even be able to detect with our senses. This pradhana by itself is essentially inert, according to the Vedic conception. But at the time of the creation of the universes, Mahavishnu glances over the pradhana and sets it into motion. At the same time, Mahavishnu injects spirit souls who have an accumulation of karma into this substrate of pradhana. So later the pradhana undergoes transformations that produce bodies for these spirit souls. So in the Sankhya philosophy, it's described that the first transformation of pradhana produces something called false ego. Then there's a further transformation that produces the principles of goodness, passion, and ignorance, the three gunas. Then a further transformation of false ego and ignorance produces the element called ether. Now, in the Vedic literature, ether is described as being space. So the idea is that material space is a kind of element, if you like. It's an actual substance, in a sense. And it's a transformation of this false ego in ignorance. So a further transformation of ether produces air, which is characterized by the principle of touch, or tactile characteristics. Ether is characterized simply by providing accommodating space for all further material phenomena. And ether is also characterized by sound vibration, or shabda. So this next transformation, air, is characterized by the additional property of touch. Then a further transformation produces the fire element, and then a further transformation produces water and then earth. So what you have here is a scheme of reductionism, in which one thing is made by a transformation of another thing. And Krishna explains in the 11th canto of the Bhagavatam that since each successive element is produced by a transformation of the preceding elements are present within each successive element. For example, fire in that sense is really just air because it's made of a transformation of air. Air is just ether because it's made of a transformation of ether, and so forth. You can make a simple example of this if you imagine taking a straight line and bending that into a sort of zigzag pattern. You could, well, if this were down here, I would draw one for you. But you can imagine a zigzag. Initially, if you look at that from a distance, it would look, say, like a broad band of, say, gray color. So you might think of this pattern as being a basic element that could be used